news, time to take a look at some of the best stories in tomorrow's papers. And joining me this evening, the Conservative MP Rehman Chishti and the former Lib Dem Deputy Press Secretary Olly Kendall. A very good evening to both of you. We will get your thoughts very shortly, but let's remind ourselves what's on the front pages of those papers. And the investigation into the death of Bristol architect Joanna Yates is on the front of the Daily Mirror, which claims to have CCTV of her final movements. That story also makes the front of The Sun, which claims her killer may have kept an item of her clothing. The Daily Mail splashes on claims that hundreds of women got pregnant despite being on a contraceptive implant. The Independent leads on a new poll suggesting support for the Lib Dems is at its lowest level since the party formed in 1988. The Guardian leads on claims that so-called bed blocking is on the rise again at British hospitals, meaning thousands of patients stay on wards long after they're fit to leave. Our booming new year, says the Daily Express. The newspaper claims the UK will avoid the feared double-dip recession. The Daily Telegraph leads on the news that nearly 250,000 students face missing out on university this year as thousands try to beat the rise in fees. The Times leads on a special investigation into Britain's sex trade. According to the Financial Times, the rising cost of importing oil is threatening the economic recovery of countries around the world. And finally, the Daily Star leads on a story about Peter Andre's private life. But you have picked second day of VAT headlines, haven't you, which is a story in The Guardian. What are they saying? Well,
let's put the political fallout to one side for a second. We've had a couple of days of VAT stories, doom and gloom. Let's start the new year with a nice positive story. Apparently, the first day of the FTSE today, after the Christmas break, rallied, and partly on the back of impressive manufacturing figures, according to this article, front page of The Guardian. The city starts 2011 with a surge, and data released yesterday, that is today, showing that manufacturers had ended 2010 by reporting their highest level of activity in 16 years under a Tory government. Who'd have thought
Well,
it?
we've got a little mixture of the coalition here, haven't we? One Lib Dem and one Tory, so no wonder you're selling it well to us.
I think as kind of metropolitanistas, we sort of forget that actually manufacturing is a pretty significant part of the economy. It constitutes more than 13% of the UK economy. It's an engine for growth, we hope.
Because it used to be a lot more than that.
Well, it may have been a lot more in the past, but I mean, the coalition keeps talking, doesn't it, about, well, yes, public sector jobs will be lost, but that the hope is, of course, that the private sector can pick up. So I guess what we would hope from this story is that if manufacturing is set for a surge, which it seems to be at the moment, then it can perhaps absorb some of those public sector
do they
losses.
explain why? Is it partly the low pound, which of course helps export?
It may be the low pound. We've obviously got low interest rates, but of course the counterbalance to that is people are now talking about the likelihood of the Bank of England at the next monetary policy meeting review, potentially increasing interest rates. And what it does say, and not in this story but in another one, is that the growth is based both on export and domestic. So it's balanced. It's not sort of contingent upon particularly strong growth because of exports to one country. It seems to be fairly sort of balanced. So with any luck, touch wood, it'll
on the day that
continue.
VAT goes up, you're basically both of you sitting here saying, "Oh, isn't it lovely out there in the economy? Shouldn't we all be feeling great about?"
But I think
UK
one's got to be realistic. It's going to be tough out there. But in terms of being optimistic, we have to be optimistic. If you look at in terms of number of mortgages being approved since April, in November had the highest number there. If we look at in terms of the overall package, corporation tax has been reduced. In terms of national insurance for the employer, that's been kept low. Otherwise, we had the labour job tax. So there's no doubt about it at all. It's going to be tough. But I think if one looks at the indications, Ollie's mentioned some of the indicators here. But if we then look at the IMF to say there'll be growth by 2% in the first few months of 2011, I think we have
first
to be
few months.
Sorry, by 2011, there will be growth. So I think in that respect, the overall package is quite promising.
I thought the first 3 months were going to be the really ropey bit of it. And in terms of mortgages, it's all relative, isn't it? They might have had good figures at the back end of last year, but compared with 2.5 years ago, it's still awful, isn't it, in terms of mortgage?
But don't forget that, the VAT increase or decrease doesn't tend to have that much effect on demand. We saw under the Labour government, they went down from 17.5% to 15%.
I thought that did boost.
No, it was marginal. So it's pretty inelastic in terms of the effect on consumer demand.
Psychological, though, isn't it, for consumers?
It is psychological, but it's marginally more liberal than I think other taxes, because at least it gives consumers the choice. They can.
But everyone says it's a regressive tax.
But I think what you have to then look at, I think the point Ollie's making is right, is in terms of the other taxes. Do you then go, which is what Labour didn't rule out, the income-based tax, from 20% to 40 to 50? Do they want to do that, which would be far harsher, or in terms of the other tax, the graduate tax on students? They never ruled that out either. One said yes, the other said no. the overall package that we've put together as a coalition.
Well, the trouble is we're subsumed with political rhetoric that is utterly unhelpful. We've got Ed Miliband saying, wrong tax, wrong time. Then we've got George Osborne this morning on the radio saying it's a progressive tax. Well, actually, it isn't a progressive tax. It's just a slightly less unfair tax than other taxes. And if Ed Miliband wants to come out and say wrong tax, wrong time, what's the right tax,
hardest in terms of the money they pay for each pound going out?
I think in terms of hitting the poorest...
And in terms of income tax, that will hit the middle classes and the higher earners, which is what the Conservatives are desperate not to do.
Finishing on this point, in terms of hitting people who are on low income hardest, we saw that with Labour under Tempe tax, and this goes nowhere near that at all, actually.
OK, I think the debate will rumble on, but as you said, the city had a little surge today, and manufacturing's looking good, so we'll leave it there. Refuse, though, looking pretty ugly, isn't it? This is in the Daily Telegraph.
I think it's absolutely awful, and we saw that, with Labour, in the end years of Labour. What they did is, in terms, say, local authorities can do it, fortnightly, which is absolutely wrong. Local residents in local authorities pay a lot of money to get their streets cleaned, actually. I think it's absolutely frontline duty of the local authority to make sure their streets are clean. When I was on the local authority as a cabinet member for safety, you work with your colleagues to make sure the streets are clean and tidy.
So the coalition is going to increase local council budgets in order to have weekly collections, is it?
I think what it's going to do, actually, is to make sure that the local authorities, work within their budgets to ensure that what they were doing before...
I think we have a coalition split here, Anna.
Right.
I think Ray's putting a very, very positive spin on the story. I mean, the fact is that we had terrible weather conditions. We had the bank holiday. Is it any wonder the councils couldn't actually meet all their refuse collection?
Well, they said it was a health and safety issue, and many people felt seeing rubbish lying around for a month was also a health and safety issue.
Well, the thing that gets me is that you've got Bob Neal, this minister, pledging to do all he can to make sure we go back to these weekly refuse collections.
Reading the Riot Act, really, I suppose,
by the way, he has no power to do that to local government. I mean, he can try and persuade them and cajole them. But at the same time, he's saying we now need these weekly refuse collections, which will cost more. But the LJ reckon that 140,000 jobs from local government will go soon. Thanks to our coalition's local government, I can't blame anyone, unfortunately. Our coalition's local government bill last year, the coalition councils have £3 billion less to spend. How are they going to afford to do these local refuse collections?
But I think there is a key point on that in terms of, if you look at urban areas where the consequences of having this rubbish out there, you've got the issue with foxes out there as well. If you've got more rubbish out there, and we saw what happened, in London where, children were attacked.
It's an issue, we agree, but how do we pay for it?
I think what we have to do is make sure that local authorities, are given the leeway, the contracts that are agreed for fortnightly, they're given the assistance from Whitehall to make sure that in these difficult times those contracts are renegotiated.
The trouble is it's easier for us to talk about devolving power to local government, but actually what the coalition is doing is it's circumventing local government, and it's this whole big society agenda. It's going straight to local people. We're giving parents powers over schools, and that's taking power away from local councils. And this is happening over a raft of issues in local government. So in many ways, I think the town hall is feeling pretty hard done by. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it's a fact. And I think the local government are going to feel pretty upset when they hear Bob Neal crowing about how they've got to do better when actually they've got less money to do more.
Yeah, big talking quickly, yeah.
One quick thing, actually, the local authority in Medway, where I was a council and cabinet member, despite what the previous government said, we kept it to weekly collections because it was the right thing to do. So people had the choice to make, and local authorities, those did it fortnightly. You sacrifice something
else, though, to have that, though, don't that's the point.
It's getting the right balance right.
Yeah, OK. Let's move on to a story in the Daily Express. It was around today as well, which is the fact that women are moving over to Islam, as many as 100,000 converting.
Yeah, the headline is slightly misleading. It says at the top, as many as 100,000 converts Islam are living in the UK. You look down the article, in fact, in the last year alone, it was 5,200. Not an insignificant amount. Many of them are women in their late 20s, according to the research. I wonder how many of those are people who are marrying a partner who is obviously Islamic, I don't know. But I think it has to be a good thing. There's so much Islamophobia in the UK, particularly after 9/11 and 7/7. And I think we use Islamophobia quite sort of liberally as a phrase. I think quite often it's actually ignorance and probably racism. And I think seeing women particularly praying in mosques, wearing the burqa, wandering around high streets in Islamic clothing, will probably break down some of those barriers that at the moment I think probably exist. I mean, it's quite normal to see a black person, an Asian person in a congregation on a Sunday in a church. And so I think the more we see white people practicing and preaching Islam, the better, frankly.
But I think also on that very point, coming from an Islamic background, the three Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism and Islam, have so much in common. And the vast majority of Muslims, who are over here, value our British traditions, cultures and values. Those who distort them at the very extreme end, they could choose to live elsewhere. But the vast majority, of Muslims are, law-abiding, in terms of, supporting our traditions,